I'm Paige Henry, the owner of Regal Financial. We proudly support YWCA Dayton's Voices Against Violence because we know the YW plays a pivotal role in our community. Thank you for following along with Voices Against Violence sessions that we've released throughout October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. For the last session, Shannon Isom, YWCA Dayton President and CEO, is going to talk about the work that the YWCA Dayton is doing to address the many intersections that impact domestic violence survivors. Please join me in making a gift to ensure this critical work continues by going to ywcadayton.org/donate.
So here we are at our last session of Voices Against Violence, the online edition at the intersections. And we are so excited to be with you all this evening. For those of you who are joining us for the first session today, we're glad that you're joining us. And for those of you who have been at all six, we're glad also that you're here. So this has been an experience and a great one. We've had some fantastic speakers throughout the day. At our faith session, we had Rula Alush and Darlene Clinkscale talk about the intersections of domestic violence and faith and how it's critical for all faith communities to collaborate with domestic violence agencies and prevention workers to ensure that they have the tools necessary to serve the women and men in their congregations experiencing domestic violence. During our immigration session, we had Danielle Fiersick talk about the complexities that folks who immigrate to the U.S. While experiencing domestic violence face and why that can exacerbate domestic violence and they can be limited in the number of resources they have available to them. During our employment session, we had Dr. Ludi Green join us to talk about some of the challenges that women and men experiencing domestic violence face and how employment can be a critical piece of it and some of the work that she's done to eliminate that barrier. During our rural communities session, Sonia Forensic talked about trauma and the way that trauma intersects with us and the way that domestic violence intersects with trauma and the way that that can be nuanced as rural communities face just some different stereotypes, but also cultural norms from other communities. And then at our last session, we had Denise Contras and Sharon McDonald talk about housing and homelessness and how housing and homelessness are, domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness for women. And Sharon shared with us some of the leading edge in terms of responses to homelessness and housing for women experiencing domestic violence. Many of those things happening right here at YWCA Dayton. And so I'm going to turn it over to our CEO, Shannon Isom, to talk about where the YWCA Dayton fits into all of this. And before I do, I just want to do one final thank you to Regal Financial, our presenting sponsor for the day, returning as our presenting sponsor for the second year in a row. They do so much to support us, and we are so very appreciative of that. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Shannon.
Thank you, Marshall. And certainly we are proud to have been able to put on our first virtual event. And I am Shannon Isom. I am the proud bearer of the mission of the YWCA Dayton. And on behalf of our board of directors and all of us here at the YWCA Dayton, thank you. We want to thank more specifically our presenting sponsor, Regal Financial. For those of you who are joining us right now for the first time in the first session, we appreciate spending a little time with us. We'd also like to thank those who had joined us for one or maybe all the sessions. Thank you. I do want to take a moment though and have a special thank you for all of our speakers, as well as our dedicated voices that join with the YWCA on a mission together to end violence against women and girls. We are only 30 minutes away from concluding our 17th annual event, Voices Against Violence. Our first, as many of you, being done virtually. I also want to take a pause we and I cannot go any further without acknowledging and joining in our nation's groans for those who mourn for lives lost due to COVID-19. We also join in mourning with the families of all of those who have felt the loss of life due to racial injustice, and likewise, we mourn the 109 fatalities due to intimate partner violence that has been felt in this past year in our state of Ohio. And we still mourn with our families, our friends, with our own community, with the mass shooting and the violence that we saw here within Dayton. For however we mourn, the tie that binds all of us is made of resolve and sadness, but also strength, and more importantly, seeds of hope and faith. Although for some of us during these trying times, it may be just a mustard. We have joined the family of the many that have had our solace and maybe even some of our naivete replaced with the ringing realization and quickened knowledge that loss can happen at any time and at anywhere. And with that knowledge, it brings its own dreaded insight that violence is without bounds. It has no real rhyme, no real rhythm, except that we know that we should expect it. And it is in that knowing of why we are here at this event. Because there are some parts of our community that we expect, that they expect violence, because we know that there are some in this Zoom room that knows there are agencies such as ours and communities of people that are expecting it. And although there's no real rhyme, there's no real rhythm, there are some here who work in this space and we lean on them. And I will tell you, for those of us, we try to stand in the gaps and we try to give a reason. And we do this year after year, reasoning to what is this maddening perpetual cycle heaped upon us and the families in which we serve. There are some of us here who already know that the violence let loose in our cities, on our families, as well as in our most sacred places, indiscriminately are but a microcosm of what has already existed for over a century in some of our zip codes, in some of our homes, in some specific gender, in their relationship, in their lives. And they've already known intimately that this violence invades their most sacred places, equally as indiscriminately. And although the violence was never okay, its presentation was palatable enough for us. It was doable because it really never touched us, as we just did some sneak peeks, maybe once a year at an event like this. I mean, in essence, right, we were never from those zip codes or from those homes, and we maybe are not in that gender or in that class or in those communities. But here we all are right now, knowing that many of us, and what many of us already knew, that violence is not bound by those things, but it is proliferated by them. It is both a shame and also a relief that we have all caught up to this same place. Not so much of the place of just being aware, but the state in which we at times are just dumbfounded, because we just at times don't know what to do. We don't know how to stop this. We don't know why this hasn't stopped, how to prepare for this. And more than anything, how the heck did we get here? And yet we are all here amongst the effects of COVID-19 and mass shootings and violence, and among perpetrators of violence that once just used to be in our homes, but now it is in our homes that we call community. But I always say this, maybe we were all built for a time such as this, to understand so deeply and now vividly how violence is not only an immobilizer, but it is also a catalyst. And we've seen it. We know that it is a catalyst for and of women. And now we get it, because it is also all of us. How violence renders us both numb as well as hurting, how it compels us to scream and yet thrives in the silence of screams, and how it both asks us to remember, but it also renders us to desperately forget. How it tells us to flee and yet it compels us somehow to just stay put, and how chaotic all of this feels, yet how we wake up, and most of us do wake up every day trying to organize all of this chaos. Dayton, we think we are better equipped now to understand the gaps that maybe we didn't understand before. The numbers are unrelenting. On average, 24 people per minute are victims of rape, of physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner here in the United States. And that makes more than 12 million women and men over the course of a single year. 1 in 4 women, 1 in 7 men experience severe intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and or intimate partner stalking. And this impacts injuries, fearfulness, post-traumatic stress disorder, and yet only 34% of those injured by any of these receive medical care. 1 in 3 women experience some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. 1 in 7 women and 1 in 18 men have been stalked by an intimate partner during their lifetime, to the point in which they felt that either they were going to be harmed or someone close to them would be harmed or even killed on a typical day. And we know these days are not typical. 20,000 phone calls come in to any one domestic violence shelter hotline nationwide. The YWCA Dayton receives over 7,000 a year. The presence of a gun in domestic violence situations increases the risk of homicide by 500%. I would like to note that almost all, 98% of mass shooters have a domestic violence background. Domestic violence victimization is part of the workplace as well. It is correlated with a higher rate of depression, as well as a higher rate of suicidal behavior. Survivors of domestic violence lose 8 million days of paid work, and that's every year. The cost of intimate partner violence that bears within businesses exceeds $8.3 billion a year, and upwards of 60% of survivors lose their jobs due to reasons stemming from direct abuse. We've seen it in Ohio. As of June 31st, we have 29 counties that have had fatal incidents of domestic violence. Dayton has had 6 fatalities since June of 2020, up over 100% from the year prior. And 18% of those fatality cases were right in front of children. The community in which I am a part of, Black women, we see even more disparate numbers. In our lifetime, sisters, 40% of us will experience intimate partner violence, which is 31.5% higher than other women's rates combined. Domestic violence is our number 1 health issue, and we are 2.7 times more likely to die when we're in a domestic violence situation. And if we are pregnant, we are 11 times more likely to be killed than our white counterparts. Being involved with the YW, both as a volunteer as well as an employee, but always, always as an expecting, anxiously hopeful advocate of now well over 10 years, I have seen these numbers. But I also sit in the seat as a mother, as a daughter, and as a sister, always as a Black woman. And I wonder if we all sit in these gaps. There is something about these numbers and the many stories and the unrelenting need that is over and over again that I lift up, not only year after year, but day after day. And these numbers, this data, these numbers are not budging. So it makes me ask, are we all standing in the gap? Well, we say it, we stand in the gap. It is in this statement that I know that if you have been with us, that you have heard us say that before. And it doesn't seem likely that most of us, if not all of us that dedicate ourselves to human being work, that we also take into the account that there are gaps. It seems counterintuitive at times that those of us that are in nonprofit, that are leaders, that are servants, workers, allies, and advocates, that we'd have to point out what seems at times so obvious. But we at the YWCA Dayton, we need to point it out. We don't only stand in the gap, we stand in the gaps. We have to point these things out. We need to speak to it and speak to the difference. We need to speak to table and spaces and even this audience that gaps are felt by our most vulnerable population, by our communities, by women, by people of color, Black people, by zip codes, and by these communities' constituents, those that are in poverty. And I'm sure many of you have heard that we are ranked as being in the top 3 cities of communities in poverty. So we use our voice, our time, our space to point to the importance that the YWCA Dayton stands, that we stand in the gaps for women of color, for Black women, and also for the poor, for the disadvantaged, for the devalued, for those that have to prove their value just to get dignity. And that means that there are many, many, many ways in which we are compelled to stand. For many of you that have been with us for the day, you have heard about how domestic violence and gaps conflate upon themselves in housing, in employment, in education, and effects of living in rural communities. And we already know that this happens in urban communities, in economics and in class structure, in religion and in faith, in citizenship status, in environment, in mental health, in addiction, in COVID, and yes, even in race. And what the YWCA Dayton has asked you to consider while all of us continue to bear is that there are many of these factors that intersect with how violence is actualized and how it is realized, and more than anything, how deadly it can be, both individually and for specific communities. Domestic violence cannot be assessed only through the gender lens anymore. It cannot be monolithically derived. Certainly not. It can no longer be defined by a singular factor. And many of us, which are familiar with this, know that this singular lens in which we look through to identify, to do what's next, is what we now need to add to no longer looking through singularly, but looking through a multifocal lens. In doing this, in looking through this single lens, we have also done in creating our own gap. It is in this gap that we then have delivered services that are without respect at times to housing, employment, class, religion, faith, citizenship, addiction, exposure, and yes, even race. The YWCA Dayton has not always looked through and known how to look through more than one lens. It wasn't until 1970 to know that when we added the one imperative, that it mattered, that the and mattered, and that we knew that even in violence that we could not, but we went even further and we said that we will not be able to empower women without ensuring that we are eliminating racism. Our mission, which has been focused on intersectionality even before the Black legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw coined the much needed term in her 1989 essay, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. Until she breathed that intersectionality, we knew it existed, and we knew that it embodied, it moved, it adjusted, it oppressed, and it hurt women. We knew it mattered. And it is this declaration of the and in our mission that has come with its own adjustment for us. It has come with its own pain. I cannot tell you, audience, how often I have heard from our stakeholders, from our own community, from activists and critics alike, in meetings, at tables, and even places that were deemed safe places, that eliminating racism was much too lofty. it wasn't doable. It wasn't needed. It was untenable. Can never be done. Why do we bother? It turns people off. It keeps them away. It is in these statements that then I am made, and I have been made, to pause, to question. It is in these statements that I think we all are moved to silently conclude and maybe deduce that empowering women is easier. It is in these statements that it just feels that we are moved to conclude that empowering women was just more doable. It was more needed. And yes, more abled. And we have been trying to empowering women, and that has been sustained. That has been done without a break, without a rest since 1850. It is in the and, or the deletion of the and, that the disparity, the gap wins. So we unapologetically stand in the gap of intersectionality. And we know that if it is able to empower women, that we are also able to eliminate racism. For those that are listening, and for those that are watching, for those who know, for those that live and manifest the effects of intersectionality, that are with me, and with clarity that you know that the deletion of the and makes for an unsafer space, an unsafer community. It proffers greater disparities, greater marginalization, and even greater risk of death. I am glad that you are joining me. I am glad that you are here. For those who never considered intersectionality, have never been here before, never knew it existed, never have had the privilege to breathe without it, welcome. I am also glad that you are here. And I ask that at the end of all of this, at the end of a very long day, where we have looked at where domestic violence and all of the factors that conflate domestic violence, I ask that you take this day and this moment to use your voice whenever you see and deem possible. I ask that you use your voice wherever you see and deem possible. I ask that you believe that your voice has already been perfected, it has already been ready for the time such as now. I ask that you support organizations that look through multiple lenses to ensure the safety, the health, and the space for women of color, for especially Black women and their children. I ask that you practice centering the most marginalized in your decision-making and in your giving. I ask that you, if you are a person of influence, that you also consider all the gaps. I ask that you and I stop together othering by class, othering by gender, and othering by race. And I ask unabashedly that you support the YWCA Dayton, or from wherever you sit, any local YWCA, because we care deeply. We believe that all women should be safe. We believe in the elimination of racism. So let us together decide that we will stand in the gaps, that we will believe that community, and that a community that uses their voice against violence is also a community that can eliminate and empower women, and is eliminate racism and empower women, and is a community that promotes peace, freedom, justice, and dignity for all people. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon, for those words, and to all those who are here listening and watching. Thank you for being here. Before we close, I don't want to take too much away from what Shannon just said, but I do want to share just a couple helpful links for all of you in attendance. Certainly, if you're able to make a donation towards the YW it would be appreciated. And the link is on the screen. But for those of you who may need help or may know somebody who needs help, please connect them with our hotline, which is 937-222-SAFE. And you can always connect with us at info@ywcadayton.org. With that being said, thank you all for your attendance. Thank you all, those speakers who are still on the line, the sponsors who are still on the line for making today possible. And with that, Shannon, do you have something else to say before we close?
Just thank you and have a good evening.